The rain fell steadily on the ancient stone cathedral of St. Margaretha's, where the Kingdom of Valdoria had held royal ceremonies for over 8 centuries. Inside the grand halls, hundreds of mourners dressed in black gathered to pay their final respects to King Edmund III, who had ruled the nation for 42 years with wisdom and grace. The atmosphere was heavy with grief, and the only sounds that echoed through the sacred space were quiet sobs and the occasional rustle of formal attire. Prince Alexander, the heir apparent and eldest son of the late king, stood at the front of the cathedral with his shoulders squared and his jaw set in determination. At 35 years old, he had spent his entire life preparing for this moment when he would ascend to the throne, but nothing could have prepared him for the overwhelming sense of loss that consumed him. His father had been more than a king to him. He had been a mentor, a friend, and the anchor that kept the royal family grounded despite the pressures of their position. Beside Alexander stood his stepmother, Queen Consort Isabella, who had married his father 7 years earlier after the death of Alexander's beloved mother, Queen Margaret. Isabella was an elegant woman in her early 50s, with silver hair that she wore in a sophisticated updo and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything. She had never quite fit into the role of the grieving widow that the public expected, and today was no different. The funeral service had been proceeding according to the ancient traditions of the kingdom. Archbishop Morrison delivered a eulogy that spoke of King Edmund's dedication to his people and his unwavering commitment to the principles of justice and compassion. The royal choir sang hymns that had been performed at royal funerals for generations, their voices rising and falling like waves of sorrow that washed over the assembled mourners. Alexander found himself lost in memories of his father. He remembered the long walks they used to take through the palace gardens when he was a child, during which his father would teach him about the responsibilities of leadership and the importance of serving others before oneself. He recalled the private conversations they had shared in recent years, when his father had begun preparing him more seriously for the role he would one day inherit. The weight of that responsibility now felt heavier than ever. The international dignitaries who had come to pay their respects filled the ornate pews of the cathedral. Presidents, prime ministers, and fellow monarchs from around the world had traveled to Valdoria to honor the memory of a king who had been respected and admired on the global stage. The media presence outside the cathedral was overwhelming, with journalists and photographers from every major news organization in the world documenting every moment of the historic event. As the service continued, Alexander noticed that his stepmother seemed unusually composed. While others around them wept openly, Isabella maintained her perfect posture and serene expression. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and she stared straight ahead at the ornate altar where King Edmund's casket was draped in the royal flag of Valdoria. The flag itself was a work of art, with intricate golden embroidery that caught the light from the cathedral's ancient chandeliers. The palace staff had worked tirelessly for days to ensure that every detail of the funeral was perfect. The flowers that adorned the cathedral were white lilies and roses, King Edmund's favorite blooms, arranged in elaborate displays that filled the air with their sweet fragrance. The ceremonial guards stood at attention throughout the service, their colorful uniforms a stark contrast to the sea of black worn by the mourners. Alexander's younger sister, Princess Sophia, sat on his other side with tears streaming down her face. At 28 years old, she had always been closer to their father than Alexander had been, perhaps because she had not carried the burden of knowing that she would one day inherit his crown. She clutched a handkerchief that had belonged to their late mother, a small comfort in her time of overwhelming grief. The economic implications of the king's death weighed heavily on Alexander's mind as well. The Kingdom of Valdoria was a constitutional monarchy with a thriving economy built on tourism, technology, and sustainable energy initiatives that King Edmund had championed throughout his reign. The smooth transition of power was crucial for maintaining the stability that investors and citizens alike depended upon. Alexander knew that the eyes of the world were watching to see how he would handle his first major challenge as the future king. As Archbishop Morrison began the final prayers of the service, the cathedral fell into a profound silence that seemed to stretch on forever. In that moment, something unexpected happened that would forever change Alexander's understanding of his family and his future. Queen Consort Isabella, who had maintained her composure throughout the entire service, turned her head slightly and caught Alexander's eye. What he saw in that instant would haunt him for years to come and set in motion a series of events that would rock the very foundations of the royal family. The subtle smile that crossed Isabella's lips lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send shockwaves through Alexander's entire being. In that sacred moment, as the final prayers were being offered for his father's soul, his stepmother's expression revealed something that chilled him to his core. It was not the gentle, reassuring smile of a woman trying to comfort her grieving stepson. Instead, it was a smile that spoke of satisfaction, of plans coming to fruition, of secrets that had been carefully guarded for years. Alexander felt his breath catch in his throat as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. He quickly looked around the cathedral to see if anyone else had noticed Isabella's inappropriate expression, but every other person in attendance appeared to be lost in their own grief or focused on the solemn ceremony taking place at the altar. The timing of her smile made it even more disturbing. It had occurred during the exact moment when the archbishop was speaking about King Edmund's peaceful transition to eternal rest. The rest of the funeral service passed in a blur for Alexander. He went through the motions of standing, sitting, and participating in the various rituals, but his mind was racing with questions and doubts that he had never allowed himself to consider before. Had his father's death truly been as natural as everyone believed? King Edmund had been in relatively good health for a man of 73, and his sudden heart attack had surprised everyone, including his personal physicians who had given him a clean bill of health just weeks before his death. As the service concluded and the royal family prepared to accompany the king's casket to the royal cemetery for the private burial ceremony, Alexander found himself studying Isabella more carefully than he ever had before. She moved with the grace and dignity expected of a queen consort, accepting condolences from world leaders and dignitaries with the perfect balance of sorrow and strength. To everyone else, she appeared to be the picture of a devoted widow struggling with her loss while maintaining her royal duties. The procession to the cemetery was a spectacle that would be remembered for generations. The horse-drawn hearse carrying King Edmund's casket was followed by members of the royal family in a series of elegant black carriages. Thousands of citizens lined the streets of the capital city, many throwing flowers and calling out their love and respect for their departed king. The outpouring of genuine emotion from the people of Valdoria only served to intensify Alexander's growing unease about what he had witnessed in the cathedral. At the private burial ceremony, which was attended only by immediate family members and the king's closest advisors, Alexander positioned himself where he could observe Isabella without being obvious about his scrutiny. The burial site was in the royal cemetery that had served the monarchy for over 5 centuries, surrounded by ancient oak trees that provided a canopy of green leaves despite the overcast sky. The simplicity of the private ceremony stood in stark contrast to the grand pageantry of the public funeral. During the burial, Alexander noticed other subtle details about Isabella's behavior that he had previously overlooked. While Princess Sophia sobbed openly and several of the king's longtime advisors wept quietly, Isabella's eyes remained dry. She spoke the traditional words of farewell with perfect pronunciation and timing, but there was something mechanical about her delivery that suggested she was simply going through the motions rather than expressing genuine emotion. As the small gathering began to disperse after the burial, Alexander made a decision that would change the course of his life. Instead of returning immediately to the palace with the other family members, he chose to remain at his father's gravesite for a few additional minutes of private reflection. He needed time to think, to process what he had seen, and to decide what, if anything, he should do about his growing suspicions. The royal cemetery was peaceful in the late afternoon light, with only the sound of birds chirping in the ancient trees and the distant murmur of traffic from the city beyond the cemetery walls. Alexander knelt beside his father's fresh grave and tried to have the conversation with him that he wished they could have had while the king was still alive. He spoke quietly about his fears, his doubts, and the terrible possibility that his father's death might not have been the natural passing that everyone believed it to be. As Alexander finally prepared to leave the cemetery, he was startled by the approach of Lord Chancellor Thomas Whitmore, one of his father's most trusted advisors and a man who had served the royal family for over 3 decades. Lord Whitmore was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen the royal family through many crises over the years. His expression was grave as he approached the future king. "Your Highness," Lord Whitmore said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I believe we need to have a private conversation. There are matters concerning your father's death that require your immediate attention." The Chancellor's words confirmed Alexander's worst fears, and set the stage for revelations that would shake the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about his family and his future as king. Lord Chancellor Whitmore led Alexander to a secluded alcove within the ancient royal library, a room that had been the site of countless private conversations between monarchs and their advisors throughout Valdoria's long history. The library's towering shelves were filled with leather-bound volumes that chronicled the kingdom's past, and the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows created an atmosphere of both grandeur and intimacy. It was here, surrounded by the wisdom of previous generations, that Alexander would learn the truth about his father's final days. "Your Highness," Lord Whitmore began, his voice heavy with the weight of the secrets he was about to reveal. "I have served this royal family faithfully for 32 years, and I have never faced a more difficult decision than the one I face today. However, your father's final wishes were clear, and I am bound by my oath to honor them, even if doing so puts us all in great danger." The Chancellor reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing the personal seal of King Edmund. The wax seal was unbroken, and Alexander could see his father's distinctive handwriting across the front of the envelope, which simply read, "For Alexander's eyes only, to be opened only after my death." The sight of his father's familiar script brought fresh tears to Alexander's eyes, but also filled him with a sense of dread about what the letter might contain. As Alexander broke the seal and unfolded the letter, he noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. The letter was written in his father's careful script, and it was dated just 1 week before the king's sudden death. The contents of the letter would forever change Alexander's understanding of his family dynamics and the true nature of the threats facing the royal family. "My dearest son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my fears have proven justified, and I am no longer alive to protect our family and our kingdom from the forces that seek to destroy everything we have built. I have discovered evidence that suggests my life is in immediate danger, and I have reason to believe that the threat comes from within our own household. I pray that I am wrong about my suspicions, but if something happens to me in the coming days, you must be prepared to act swiftly to protect both yourself and the crown." The letter went on to detail King Edmund's growing concerns about Queen Consort Isabella and her increasingly frequent private meetings with certain members of the royal council who had historically opposed many of the king's progressive policies. King Edmund had begun to suspect that Isabella was working with these council members to orchestrate a palace coup that would remove him from power and potentially eliminate Alexander from the line of succession in favor of a more malleable ruler who would serve their interests. According to the letter, King Edmund had hired a private investigator to look into Isabella's background more thoroughly than had been done during the standard security clearance process when they were married. The investigation had revealed disturbing connections between Isabella and several foreign business interests that stood to gain significantly from changes in Valdoria's trade policies and environmental regulations. The king had also discovered that Isabella had been secretly meeting with representatives from these business interests, and that large sums of money had been transferred into offshore accounts that could be traced back to her. Lord Whitmore watched Alexander's face carefully as the prince read his father's final message. "Your father came to me with these concerns 3 days before his death," the chancellor explained. "He asked me to help him gather additional evidence before confronting the queen consort directly. We were planning to meet the morning after his death to review what our investigators had uncovered. Instead, I received the call that he had suffered a massive heart attack during the night." The letter continued with King Edmund's instructions for how Alexander should proceed if the worst-case scenario came to pass. The king had established a secret trust fund that would provide Alexander with the financial resources necessary to conduct his own investigation and to protect himself from the same fate that may have befallen his father. He had also arranged for certain loyal members of the royal guard to be available to Alexander should he need protection from threats within the palace itself. Perhaps most importantly, King Edmund had discovered the existence of a hidden safe in the royal chambers that contained documents and evidence that Isabella was unaware of. The combination to the safe was hidden within a seemingly innocent family photograph that hung in the king's private study, and the contents of the safe would provide Alexander with the proof he needed to expose the conspiracy against the royal family. As Alexander finished reading the letter, he felt a mixture of grief, anger, and determination that threatened to overwhelm him. The father he had admired and respected had spent his final days living in fear for his life, unable to trust the woman he had married, and some of the advisors he had relied upon for years. The weight of responsibility that Alexander now carried was almost unbearable. He was not only inheriting a crown, but also a deadly game of palace intrigue that could cost him his life if he made a single wrong move. "What do we do now?" Alexander asked Lord Whitmore, his voice barely above a whisper. The Chancellor's response would set in motion a dangerous investigation that would test every skill Alexander had learned about leadership, strategy, and survival in the treacherous world of royal politics. "Now, Your Highness, we must be very careful about who we trust and how we proceed. Your father's death has given Isabella and her allies a significant advantage, but they do not yet know that we are aware of their plot. We must use that element of surprise wisely, because we may not get a second chance to expose the truth and protect the kingdom from those who would destroy it for their own gain." The following weeks after King Edmund's funeral were a delicate dance of deception and investigation for Prince Alexander. Publicly, he threw himself into his new role as the king-elect, participating in meetings with government officials, attending state functions, and beginning the formal process of preparing for his coronation. Privately, however, he was conducting the most important investigation of his life, one that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the kingdom of Valdoria itself. Working closely with Lord Chancellor Whitmore and a small group of trusted allies, Alexander began the dangerous process of gathering evidence against Queen Consort Isabella and her co-conspirators. The first breakthrough came when they successfully accessed the hidden safe in King Edmund's private study. Using the clues provided in his father's letter, Alexander was able to decode the combination from the family photograph and discover a treasure trove of documents that painted a disturbing picture of corruption and betrayal at the highest levels of the royal government. The documents revealed that Isabella had been working with a consortium of international business interests led by a shadowy figure known only as the Architect. This individual had orchestrated similar operations in other small European kingdoms, using insider connections to manipulate government policies in ways that benefited their extensive business empire. The ultimate goal was to transform Valdoria from a progressive constitutional monarchy into a puppet state that would serve the economic interests of the Architects organization. Isabella's role in the conspiracy was more extensive than Alexander had initially feared. According to the evidence his father had gathered, she had been systematically poisoning King Edmund with small doses of a rare toxin that mimicked the symptoms of heart disease. The poison, which was virtually undetectable in standard medical examinations, had been slowly weakening the king's heart over a period of several months, making his sudden death appear to be the result of natural causes. The medical records that King Edmund had secretly obtained showed traces of the poison in his blood work from his final weeks, but the levels were so low that they had been dismissed as laboratory contamination. The king's private physician, Dr. Harrison Matthews, had unknowingly been complicit in the cover-up by attributing the king's increasing fatigue and occasional chest pains to the normal stress of royal duties and his advancing age. As Alexander delved deeper into the conspiracy, he discovered that Isabella's influence extended far beyond the royal household. She had been working to place her allies in key positions throughout the government, including the Ministry of Finance, the Department of Trade, and even within the royal security forces. Several members of the royal council who had been vocal opponents of King Edmund's environmental policies were revealed to be receiving substantial payments from the Architects organization. The most shocking revelation came when Alexander learned that the conspiracy included plans for his own elimination. Documents found in the safe indicated that once Isabella had secured her position as regent following King Edmund's death, she intended to arrange for Alexander to suffer a similar fate. The plan was to gradually undermine his credibility as a leader while simultaneously exposing him to the same slow-acting poison that had killed his father. Princess Sophia was to be spared, as she posed no threat to the succession plans and could potentially serve as a useful pawn in the new regime. Alexander realized that he was living on borrowed time and that he needed to act quickly before Isabella and her allies discovered that their conspiracy had been exposed. However, he also knew that making accusations against the queen consort without absolute proof would be political suicide and could potentially trigger a civil war that would tear the kingdom apart. The prince decided to set a trap that would force Isabella to reveal her true intentions while providing him with the evidence he needed to expose the entire conspiracy. Working with Lord Chancellor Whitmore, Alexander began spreading false information suggesting that King Edmund had left behind additional documents that could implicate certain members of the royal council in financial improprieties. The bait was carefully designed to panic Isabella and her co-conspirators into taking desperate action that would reveal their guilt. The trap worked better than Alexander had dared to hope. Within days of the false information being leaked, Isabella requested a private meeting with several key members of the royal council, including Lord Geoffrey Pemberton and Minister of Finance Harold Blackwood, both of whom Alexander now knew were part of the conspiracy. Unknown to Isabella, Alexander had arranged for their meeting to be secretly recorded using sophisticated surveillance equipment installed by loyal members of the royal security forces. The recorded conversation provided Alexander with everything he needed to expose the conspiracy and bring the traitors to justice. Isabella and her allies discussed their plans to eliminate him within the next few weeks, their methods for transferring Valdoria's assets to offshore accounts controlled by the architect, and their strategy for maintaining power once they had eliminated the legitimate royal line. The cold, calculating manner in which they discussed murder and treason left no doubt about their guilt or their complete lack of loyalty to the kingdom they had sworn to serve. Armed with irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy, Alexander prepared to make his move. However, he knew that he had only one chance to get it right, and that the slightest mistake could cost him everything, including his life. The final confrontation with Isabella and her allies would require all of his political skills, his courage, and his commitment to the principles his father had taught him about justice and duty to the crown. The great throne room of Valdoria Palace had witnessed many dramatic moments throughout its 800-year history, but none quite like the confrontation that was about to unfold on a crisp morning in late October. Alexander had chosen this ancient chamber for the final revelation, knowing that its grandeur and historical significance would lend weight to the accusations he was about to make. The room's soaring ceilings, ornate tapestries, and gleaming marble floors had seen the rise and fall of dynasties, and today they would witness either the salvation or the destruction of the current royal line. Isabella entered the throne room believing she had been summoned for a routine discussion about coronation planning. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a navy blue suit that conveyed both elegance and authority. Her silver hair was styled in her signature updo, and her blue eyes sparkled with the confidence of someone who believed she had successfully orchestrated the perfect crime. She had no idea that Alexander knew the truth about his father's death, or that every step she had taken over the past months had been carefully documented and recorded. Present in the throne room were the key players in the conspiracy, all of whom had been invited under various pretenses. Lord Geoffrey Pemberton had been told that Alexander wanted to discuss reforms to the royal council. Minister of Finance Harold Blackwood believed he was there to review the coronation budget. Several other conspirators were scattered throughout the room, each unaware that the others were also present and completely oblivious to the trap that had been set for them. Also present were Alexander's most trusted allies, Lord Chancellor Whitmore, Princess Sophia, who had been briefed on the situation the night before, and Captain Marcus Steele of the Royal Guard, a decorated soldier whose loyalty to the crown was beyond question. Hidden throughout the room were additional security personnel who were prepared to act if the confrontation turned violent. Alexander took his position on the steps leading to the throne, a symbolic choice that emphasized his authority as the rightful heir while also allowing him to address everyone in the room from a position of strength. In his hands, he carried a leather portfolio containing copies of all the evidence he had gathered, including the recordings of Isabella's treasonous conversations, the financial documents linking her to the architect, and the medical evidence proving that his father had been murdered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the vast chamber, "I have gathered you here today to address a matter of the utmost importance to the security and future of our kingdom. Over the past several weeks, I have uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reaches to the very heart of our government, a conspiracy that resulted in the murder of my father, King Edmund III. The reaction in the room was immediate and telling. Isabella's face went pale, but she maintained her composure with the skill of someone who had been practicing deception for years. Lord Pemberton shifted nervously in his chair, while Minister Blackwood appeared to be calculating his chances of reaching one of the exits. Several other conspirators exchanged worried glances, but none of them yet understood the full extent of their exposure. "These are very serious accusations, Alexander," Isabella said, her voice steady but with an underlying tension that betrayed her growing anxiety. "I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims, because they could be considered slanderous if they prove to be unfounded." Alexander smiled grimly and opened his portfolio. "Oh, I have evidence, stepmother. More evidence than you could possibly imagine." He began by playing the recorded conversation in which Isabella and her allies discussed their plans to eliminate him within weeks of the funeral. The voices were crystal clear, and the content was undeniably incriminating. As the recording played, the color drained from Isabella's face, and several of the conspirators began to panic. The evidence presentation continued for nearly an hour, during which Alexander methodically laid out the entire conspiracy in excruciating detail. He revealed the financial connections between Isabella and the architect, the systematic poisoning of King Edmund, the plans to eliminate the legitimate royal line, and the ultimate goal of transforming Valdoria into a puppet state controlled by foreign business interests. With each revelation, Isabella's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The woman who had maintained perfect composure during her husband's funeral was now visibly shaking, and her blue eyes had lost their confident sparkle. When Alexander presented the medical evidence proving that King Edmund had been poisoned, Isabella finally broke down completely. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking with emotion that seemed genuine for the first time since Alexander had known her. "You have no idea what kind of people you're dealing with. The architect isn't just a businessman. He's someone who destroys anyone who gets in his way. Your father was going to expose operations that span across multiple countries. They would have killed him anyway, and they would have killed you too. I thought that if I cooperated with them, I could at least save your life and Sophia's." Alexander felt a moment of doubt as he listened to Isabella's explanation. Was it possible that she had been acting out of fear rather than greed? Had she been trying to protect the royal family in the only way she thought possible? However, his doubts were quickly dispelled when Lord Chancellor Whitmore presented additional evidence that showed Isabella had been in contact with the architects' organization for over 2 years, long before King Edmund had discovered their activities. The final piece of evidence was a letter written in Isabella's own hand, outlining her plans to marry King Edmund specifically for the purpose of gaining access to Valdoria's government secrets. The letter, which had been found in a safety deposit box registered under one of her false identities, proved that her entire relationship with the royal family had been a carefully orchestrated deception from the very beginning. As the evidence presentation concluded, Captain Steele and his security personnel moved into position to arrest the conspirators. Isabella made one last desperate attempt to escape, but she was quickly apprehended by the royal guards. As she was led away in handcuffs, she turned to Alexander with a look of pure hatred that revealed her true nature. "You think you've won," she hissed, "but the architect has resources and connections that you can't even imagine. This isn't over, Alexander. It will never be over." The trials that followed would dominate headlines around the world for months. Isabella and her co-conspirators were convicted of treason, murder, and conspiracy against the crown. The international investigation that resulted from Alexander's evidence led to the arrest of dozens of individuals in multiple countries and the dismantling of one of the largest corruption networks in modern European history. Alexander's coronation took place 6 months later, in the same cathedral where his father had been laid to rest. As he took the oath to serve and protect the people of Valdoria, he thought about the smile that Isabella had given him at his father's funeral, the smile that had ultimately led to her downfall. That moment of arrogance and satisfaction had been the first crack in her carefully constructed facade, and it had given Alexander the motivation he needed to seek the truth about his father's death. The new king faced many challenges in the years that followed, including ongoing threats from the architects' remaining network and the difficult task of rebuilding trust in the royal government. However, he never forgot the lessons he had learned during those dark weeks following his father's funeral. That power corrupts even those closest to you, that the truth is worth any sacrifice to uncover, and that sometimes the greatest threats to a kingdom come not from foreign enemies, but from the smiles of those who claim to love you most.